Ah, Rome. Beyond its cobblestone streets, you can feel the heartbeat of an empire. The echoes of power, splendor, and triumph have never ceased in these lands. But today, dear listeners, I will take you not to the story of a conqueror who expanded borders with his armies, but to the story of a king who shaped the world with his pen. Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher who sat on the throne of Rome, a sage who ruled the empire guided by his intellect. The story of Marcus Aurelius is not the saga of an ordinary ruler. His life is a search for balance between the noise of the battlefields and the philosophical musings he wrote on a quiet evening. For his Rome, time brought more chaos than peace. At the heart of a period of plagues, wars, and enemies, a philosopher king sought to transcend the darkness with wisdom. And who was this man? What made him different from other emperors? How did a leader combine his sword and crown with a book of philosophy that sought answers to the deep questions of humanity? As I step into the life of Marcus Aurelius, I will take you back to the golden age of Rome, to the deep human struggles that lay behind the stone walls. Get ready. This is not just the story of a ruler, but a journey that pushes the boundaries of the human spirit. First, you will see Christ's figure in spirit, buried and rising. Ah, friends, we are now embarking on a journey through the golden age, the glorious era of the Roman Empire. Close your eyes and imagine those times. This ancient city, built on 7 hills, shone like a light at the center of the world. The roads of Rome stretched like veins connecting the heart of the empire to the farthest corners. Every stone, every pillar was a reflection of power, splendor, and wisdom. But behind this splendor lay a complex world, where Rome was sustained not only by the might of the sword, but also by political intrigue and social upheaval. Marcus Aurelius was born in such a period. The glimmer of this golden age was the last gasp of the Pax Romana. The Roman Empire, with the legacy of Augustus, had laid the foundations of peace and order, but underneath this order, new problems were sprouting. Borders had expanded and conflicts with barbarian tribes were frequent. There was an endless struggle with the Parthians in the east and the Germans in the north. For an emperor, this meant constant movement, wielding a sword to ensure justice and order on the battlefields. But Marcus Aurelius was not only a warrior leader, he was also a sage who sought the meaning of peace. As for the political structure, the Senate was still at the heart of Rome, but the real power was now in the hands of the emperor. The emperor was seen as both a leader and the representative of a god on earth. In the eyes of the people, the emperor was the protector of the state, the guarantor of peace and prosperity. As Marcus Aurelius carried this sacred burden on his shoulders, he also felt deeply the loneliness of the task. It was a time when loyalty and betrayal were side by side, when the balance of power danced on a thin tightrope. And the currency for trust was faith. When we look at the social structure, the people of Rome lived together in diversity, a world where rich aristocratic families lived a luxurious life in their magnificent villas, while slaves kept this system alive with their labor. In forums and marketplaces, people discussed the decisions of the state, while entertainment was organized in theaters and arenas. But beneath this splendor, cracks were becoming increasingly apparent. Taxes were becoming heavier and rural poverty deepened. Marcus Aurelius's eyes saw this imbalance, and his heart was filled with a desire to do justice. And then there was another guest knocking at the door: the plague. The plague was a disaster that shook the backbone of the empire, weakened armies, and caused days of fear and despair in the cities. It was in these circumstances that Marcus Aurelius ascended the Roman throne. But he decided to fight these problems not only with the sword, but also with his pen. Because he was not only a ruler, but also a philosopher who sought answers to questions about the depths of the human soul. So, dear friends, in such a period, how did Marcus Aurelius shoulder both the burden of the empire and the most ancient questions of humanity? In the midst of this chaos, how did he maintain his inner peace and search for wisdom? So, now we are at the point where we are going to look for answers to these questions. Ah, dear friends, now we go back to that golden age of Rome, when the young Marcus Aurelius was just a boy. Even for a would-be emperor, the first years of life are a time of formation. Marcus was growing up in the shadow of Rome's noisy forums, its lavish villas and cobbled roads. But his fate was not that of an ordinary Roman boy. The noble blood running through his veins set him apart even then. His family came from the noble classes of Rome, but the responsibility that came with nobility was placed on Marcus's shoulders at an early age. Marcus's mother was a virtuous woman, devoted to her son. She taught him the power of silence and the value of patience. His father passed away when Marcus was only 3 years old. This loss perhaps set him on a journey of deep inner questioning about life. Although young Marcus was deprived of a father figure, other members of his family spared no sacrifice for his education. They put him in the hands of the most distinguished teachers of the time to equip him with the knowledge and wisdom required of a leader. The second part relates to the third corner, which is the hidden corner of the leader's heart. It was a time when Rome was an ocean of wisdom. Philosophy, literature, and law were highly valued among the highest strata of society. It was in this atmosphere that Marcus was introduced to the Stoic philosophy that would shape his life. Stoicism was a philosophy that preached that man should find tranquility within himself and develop a peace of mind independent of the chaos of the outside world. These teachings, which resonated in Marcus's soul, would become one of the most important touchstones of his life. But, dear friends, don't think that philosophy is just a dry text or a cold doctrine. The people who taught it shaped Marcus's soul like a sculptor carving a block of marble. Among his teachers, there was one name that had a great influence on him: Quintus Junius Rusticus. With his words of wisdom and calm demeanor, Rusticus not only taught Marcus Stoicism, but also showed him how to live it. Under the guidance of Rusticus, Marcus learned how to discipline one's own thoughts, and that virtue is the highest purpose of life. And another name, Claudius Severus. What he taught was that man has responsibilities not only as an individual, but also as part of a society. Marcus learned from him that justice and service to his people were the highest virtues of a leader. His passion for the books and wise texts of that time was perhaps a seed that Severus planted in his heart. In the years to come, Marcus's own writings would open up the inner world of a Stoic leader. Marcus's teenage years were filled with discipline, patience, and learning. But of course, a young man's blood runs hot, so he sometimes asked questions, sometimes challenged teachings. But each time he found his way again, guided by the light of philosophy. In the process, he was learning about the transitory nature of life, that material things would one day fade away, and that what really matters is inner peace. This search for depth, which began at a young age, would later become his greatest strength, both in the administration of the empire and in his own inner world. So friends, how is this young Marcus going to apply these teachings when he would one day rule an entire empire? How would these simple but powerful principles of Stoicism shape his reign? Let's look for answers to these questions in the next chapter. Parts 1. Dear friends, let us now step back from the youth of Marcus Aurelius to the long and arduous path that led him to the summit of Rome. It is a story not only of the throne, but also of virtue, sacrifice, and a leadership steeped in wisdom. Marcus was introduced to the teachings of the Stoic philosophy at a young age. These teachings encircled his soul like armor. But wisdom alone is not enough. It takes experience, patience, and diplomacy to become an emperor. It was a story that began with the election of Marcus as successor to Antoninus Pius, a turning point that set the stage for Rome's golden age. Marcus was a successful legislator and trader as well, and he played a crucial role in the lives of his reign long after his death. His death was counted in the bourgeois press, acquiring the attention of all Russia's readers. Antoninus Pius, his name is etched in Roman history as an emperor of justice and peace. He was Marcus's mentor and guide. One day this wise emperor, who shaped Marcus's destiny, called him to his side. Thinking of the future of Rome, he named Marcus as his heir. This decision was a sign not only of confidence in young Marcus's abilities, but also of a desire to see the future of Rome in virtuous hands. But this did not mean that Marcus would immediately ascend to the throne. No, dear friends, Antoninus would patiently and meticulously prepare him for the empire. This preparation process for Marcus continued for many years. First, he had to learn Rome's complex bureaucracy. Antoninus directed him to work closely with the Senate so that he could master the finer details of the state. By attending sessions of the Senate, Marcus began to understand Rome's laws, the needs of its people, and the workings of the vast empire. The Senate was the heart of the empire, and learning how that heart beat was one of the most fundamental tasks of an emperor. But Marcus wasn't only preoccupied with governance. Antoninus also taught him the art of diplomacy. Communicating with the rulers of provinces all over Rome, building bridges between different cultures and traditions, was one of the most important skills of a leader. Marcus was learning that keeping peace across Rome's vast borders was not only possible with the sword, but also with the mind. It was during these years that he learned to use diplomacy as a tool and never hesitate to win allies when necessary. At this time, Marcus was accompanied by Lucius Verus. Lucius was Marcus's half-brother and another future successor to the throne. Lucius was more ambitious, more enthusiastic, but Antoninus's plan was to balance these two different characters. The serenity and wisdom of Marcus and the energy and courage of Lucius would be an ideal partnership for Rome. Antoninus wanted to guarantee the future of Rome by training these two young men together. Throughout these years of preparation, Marcus was like a shadow at Antoninus's side. He observed his decisions, learned of his triumphs, and sometimes his mistakes. The patience and justice of Antoninus's rule was a guide for Marcus. Gradually, he began to realize that the governance of Rome was not just a matter of power, but also a matter of service. It was a leader's greatest responsibility to treat his people fairly, to win their trust, and to keep Rome at peace. And then, dear friends, when the time came for Antoninus to die, Marcus was ready. But this ascension to the throne would not only give him the crown of a ruler, but also a heavy responsibility. The great empire of Rome was now in his hands. How would Marcus Aurelius apply what he had learned in the shadow of Antoninus Pius to his own reign? How would the imperial crown test his virtuous soul? Let us seek answers to these questions together. My friends, now I am going to tell you about one of the most unique periods in Roman history. We are going to travel beyond the days when the Roman throne was carried on the shoulders of only one man, to that rare time when two emperors ruled together. The heroes of this story are Marcus Aurelius and his half-brother Lucius Verus. These two men, with their different temperaments, their different talents, ruled Rome's vast empire together, one following the path of reason and wisdom, the other the embodiment of energy and courage. When Marcus Aurelius inherited the legacy of Antoninus Pius, he alone was not considered worthy of the imperial crown. In the last moments of his life, Antoninus wanted the two brothers to jointly rule Rome. The reasons behind this decision were not only political necessity, but also the need to unite disparate forces to manage Rome's complex structure. Marcus Aurelius was a sage who had won the hearts of the people with his deep thoughts and Stoic principles. Lucius Verus was a younger, more enthusiastic leader, skilled in military affairs. Rome's vast territory demanded the qualities of these two different leaders at the same time. But friends, it is not always an easy task when two monarchs share a throne. Marcus Aurelius's wise and dignified rule commanded great respect in the Roman Senate. Every word spoken in his presence was carefully chosen, for Marcus was not only after words but also intentions. Lucius Verus, on the other hand, was often seen as a less formal leader. He traveled among the people, spent time with the armies, and focused on the more outward-looking affairs of the empire. This difference between the two leaders allowed them to ensure Rome's internal peace and border security at the same time. Lucius Verus especially distinguished himself on the eastern frontiers. The ongoing wars with the Parthian Empire posed a great threat to Rome. Lucius took command of these wars and went on campaigns to defend the eastern lands of the empire. At that time, having an emperor at the head of the army provided morale and motivation for the soldiers. Lucius's victories in the east proved his leadership skills. But these successes were made possible not only by his courage, but also by Marcus's stable rule at the center of Rome. Marcus organized Rome's internal affairs while at the same time providing the necessary resources for Lucius' campaigns, balancing economic policies to meet the needs of the army. But this joint governance was not only a collaboration, it was also a test. The differences between the two leaders sometimes created tension. Marcus's discipline based on Stoic principles contrasted with Lucius's more liberal and luxurious lifestyle. While Lucius organized grand feasts to celebrate his victories, Marcus generally preferred to avoid such ostentation. However, these differences never turned into enmity. The gladiators, or both, had learned to put the interests of Rome above all else. Their bond was based less on personal rapport than on a shared commitment to the task of preserving the glory of the empire. Before he turned his attention to the captured Egyptian traitor pirates, he began to rethink. Friends, the combined rule of these two leaders provided a great balance to both the east and west of Rome. Marcus Aurelius's wise leadership and Lucius Verus's bravery on the battlefield protected Rome from internal and external threats, if only for a while. However, as in every story, there was a test of fate. The sudden death of Lucius Verus brought an end to this partnership and left Marcus Aurelius as the sole leader of the empire. So, my friends, how did this sudden loss affect the reign of Marcus Aurelius? What trials did Rome's progress on the shoulders of a lone wise emperor bring to the empire? Let's look for answers to these questions in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, now I will take you to the philosophy in the heart of a ruler, to the justice on the throne of a sage. The Rome ruled by Marcus Aurelius was not only an empire of swords and legions, it was also ruled by deep thought, by a great faith in humanity. At the heart of this rule was the Stoic philosophy. Marcus was not only an emperor but also a philosopher, a seeker of wisdom. To understand his understanding of governance, we need to get into the spirit of Stoicism. Stoic philosophy saw life as a theater stage. People play roles on this stage. Some become kings, some peasants, some soldiers. But in the end, each of us is no more than an actor on the stage. What matters is not what role we play, but how we play it. Marcus took this understanding as a guide. For him, being an emperor was not just about sitting on a throne. Justice, responsibility, and putting the welfare of his people ahead of his own interests were his greatest virtues. Marcus saw his people as his own family. Sitting in the court of justice, every case that came before him was not just an application of the law, but a test of conscience. When making a decision, he would always ask, will this decision be right, not only for today, but also for tomorrow? As the Stoics taught, everything has a nature, and the nature of justice is to protect the rights of all. Marcus would not allow the strong to oppress the weak. At the heart of Rome, he believed that everyone, from peasant to senator, should benefit from a just government. For him, law was not just a tool, but a sacred duty. Of course, this sense of justice was felt not only in courtrooms, but in every corner of the empire. Marcus wrote letters to governors, commanders, and administrators all over Rome, reminding each of them to observe justice. In these letters, he spoke not only of the law, but also of the weaknesses of human nature and the need for leaders not to fall into the traps of pride. The emperor's writings are still a lesson for humanity today. In his view, a leader's power grew not by frightening his people, but by inspiring them. But friends, Marcus's sense of justice extended not only to his people, but also to his own family. He even warned his own son when necessary, reminding him that he was not privileged from others, because, as Stoicism teaches, everyone is subject to the laws of nature and no one is above them. While Marcus ruled his people with these principles, he also often held himself to account. When he was alone at night, he would question his own behavior, weighing his mistakes one by one in his mind, aiming to be a better leader for the next day. His self-discipline brought a wisdom to the Roman throne that would not be forgotten for centuries. But friends, ruling with justice is not always easy. As Marcus Aurelius held fast to his Stoic principles, he had to face the pressures of the Senate and the turmoil of the battlefields. But how would his philosophical stance hold up in the face of the great trials facing Rome? Would the light of Stoicism continue to illuminate Marcus's path in the face of wars, epidemics, and betrayals? Let's look for the answers to these questions together in the next chapter. Ah, dear friends, I will now take you to the cold forests to the north of Rome and the fiery deserts to the east, where the great battles that decided the fate of the Roman Empire were shaped by the wise leadership of Marcus Aurelius. Because an emperor does not rule only in palaces and senate halls. Sometimes he has to fight like a soldier at the head of his army on the battlefield. Marcus was just such a leader. The years of his reign were filled with epics of resistance against Rome's enemies. First, let's look north to those cold lands. the Germanic tribes. Ah, friends, these peoples were always a threat to Rome. Powerful, ruthless, and fiercely independent, they raided the borders of the empire, threatening Rome's peace. Marcus did not, as many rulers before him had done, leave these attacks to the legions alone. He decided to take the battlefield himself because he never forgot a piece of advice from Stoic philosophy. The most difficult tasks must be undertaken by the leader himself. Marcus led his army and embarked on a long struggle against the Teutons on the banks of the Danube. These battles were not easy, friends. The enemy was formidable not only in numbers but also in battle strategy. The Teutons responded to the discipline of the Roman legions with chaotic and rapid attacks. But Marcus withstood these attacks with great patience and wisdom. On the one hand, he kept the morale of his soldiers high, and on the other, he met their needs meticulously. He would eat with his soldiers in the tents and listen to their stories. This showed that Marcus was more than a commander. He was a leader. During one campaign, he won a great victory in the frozen waters of the Danube. Although this victory discouraged the Teutons, Marcus knew that there was still much work to be done, for the enemy could not be completely destroyed in one battle. He understood that peace could only be achieved through a wise strategy and a strong defense. But friends, it was not only Rome's northern borders that were under threat. In the east, the Parthians had re-emerged as Rome's old enemy. In defiance of Rome, the Parthian kingdom had attacked the eastern territories, creating chaos there. Marcus took this threat seriously, but fighting on two major fronts at the same time was not easy for any leader. So he appointed a capable commander to lead the eastern campaign, Lucius Verus. Lucius was Marcus's co-emperor, but his leadership skills were not as laudable as Marcus's. Nevertheless, Marcus put his trust in him. Lucius achieved important victories for Rome in his campaigns against the Parthians. But behind these victories was Marcus's strategic planning and patient diplomacy. Marcus's military leadership was characterized not only by his skill on the battlefield, but also by his efforts to prevent war and keep the peace. After the wars with the Teutons, he had new fortresses built along the Danube to strengthen the defense of Rome's borders. By the end of the struggle with the Parthians, he had established both military and diplomatic superiority over his enemies. Marcus aimed at the long-term security of Rome rather than merely gaining territory. For him, victory meant a lasting peace, not a temporary success. And yet, but dear friends, wars are not fought only against external enemies. During Marcus's reign, another enemy was eating away at Rome from within: the plague. Although soldiers were winning victories on the front lines, this invisible enemy was ravaging every corner of the empire. So how would Marcus Aurelius deal with this internal crisis? Would his leadership on the battlefields be enough to save his people from a deadly plague? We will look for the answers to these questions together in the next chapter. Friends, let us now take a journey into the soul of Marcus Aurelius, into the depths of his bonds with his people and his army. For the true power of a leader lies not only in his sword, but in the hearts of his people and his soldiers. Marcus was not just an emperor, he was a philosopher king. He saw the power of the throne as a burden and a responsibility, and he carried it with justice, wisdom, and compassion. His leadership was based on earning the trust and love of his people and soldiers, not just issuing orders. On the one hand, he strengthened the legal system to ensure fair trials for his people, and on the other, he developed social programs to support the poor. Yes, dear friends, Marcus was a leader dedicated to improving not only the borders of the empire, but also the lives of the people. Marcus's relationship with his people was as sincere and protective as a father's love for his children. When he walked the streets of Rome, he listened to his people to understand their problems. He was not in the palace, but sometimes in the market, sometimes in a worker's workshop. He listened to the suffering of his people and sought solutions. He personally read the letters from the provinces and wanted to know the problems down to the smallest detail. On the one hand, he strengthened the legal system to ensure fair trials for his people, and on the other, he developed social programs to support the poor. Yes, dear friends, Marcus was a leader dedicated to improving not only the borders of the empire, but also the lives of the people. His approval rating estimated at around 80%, and a 90% rating for expressing feelings of kindness towards the poor. But the test of a philosopher king is to be as wise with his army as he is with his people. Marcus's bond with his soldiers is a different story. For him, the army was not just a war machine, but a family. During the difficult days of war on the banks of the Danube, he stayed in the same tents with his soldiers. He shared their fatigue and tried to ease their pain. It is told that he visited the tent of a sick soldier and gave him moral support. For Marcus did not see his soldiers as mere names. They were the guardians of the empire and the guarantors of the people's peace. Once, during a long campaign, he noticed that the morale of the soldiers had deteriorated. There was a shortage of food for the winter, and many soldiers were missing their families. That's when Marcus took a step to win the soldiers' hearts. He ate with them, listened to their stories, and dictated letters to be sent to the soldiers' children. This gesture not only increased their courage, but also made Marcus a father figure in their eyes, not an emperor. Marcus, who adhered strictly to the Stoic philosophy, did not forget the importance of treating his army humanely, while maintaining discipline. His victories over the Germanic tribes were not only based on strategy, but also on the trust and loyalty of his soldiers. Soldiers obeyed his orders not only out of obligation, but out of a sense of righteousness and trust. Ah, dear friends, this balance in Marcus's leadership was like the mortar that held his people and his army together. But fate was preparing a tragedy that would once again test this wise emperor and his bond with his people and his soldiers. How would Marcus Aurelius cope with the plague that hung over Rome like a dark cloud? What sacrifices would he make to save his people and his army from this catastrophe? The answers to these questions await you in the next episode. Ah, dear friends, when the name of Marcus Aurelius is mentioned, one must remember that he was not only an emperor, but also a thinker, a seeker of wisdom. And one of the most precious legacies left to us by this profound soul is undoubtedly his meditations, Reflections on Myself. This book bears the traces of a man's inner journey rather than the splendor of a throne. However, when he wrote these lines, Marcus did not intend to leave a work. He was talking to himself. Let us examine together how this text was born, its philosophical messages, and its lasting impact. Marcus Aurelius penned these thoughts during the most difficult periods of his life. Under the harsh winds of the battlefields and the heavy burden of the palace. The lines he wrote on the banks of the Danube River, in his cold tent, during the hours when his soldiers were resting, are like a mirror of his mental world. These thoughts were not written to impress a people, nor to spread a philosophical movement. They were an inner monologue in which Marcus spoke to his own soul and questioned himself. This book bears witness to a man's existential questions and his search for virtue. Each sentence is a reflection of the burdens a leader has to carry, a philosopher's search for meaning, and a human being's confrontation with his own mistakes. It is possible to see all the depths of Stoicism in the work. From Marcus's point of view, life may be full of suffering, but one should meet this suffering with virtue and establish an inner order against the chaos of the external world. For him, what we cannot control should never destroy us. Instead, we should focus on controlling our own actions, thoughts, and reactions. Marcus' philosophy can illuminate the path of every human being, not just an emperor. When evil touches you, do not let it change you. Keep your virtue and be just. Imagine that these lines reach us from thousands of years ago, yet they are still fresh. Because what Marcus wrote speaks to the common problems, fears, and hopes of humankind. As a ruler, he had power, but he knew all too well the transience of that power. The burden of being a leader was, in his eyes, part of a greater responsibility, to keep his own soul and conscience pure. He managed to live a life of wisdom without falling under the spell of the throne. Today, the meditations guide millions of people around the world. From leaders to ordinary people, this text has become a source of reflection and self-improvement for everyone. Even centuries after Marcus's death, his philosophical messages transcend time. Because this book is not about any particular era or status, but about the essence of being human. But friends, think about it. Did such a wise man's search for inner peace really always succeed? When the chaos of the outside world tried to triumph over Marcus's deep thoughts, how did he proceed? As we approach the final chapter of Marcus's life, we will discover together what kind of ending he was preparing in the shadow of his words of wisdom, in the shadow of his words of wisdom. Ah, my dear friends, imagine an emperor, a leader, who carried on his shoulders not only the welfare of his people, but also the fate of an empire. Marcus Aurelius's reign was filled with great struggles to preserve the glory of Rome, but perhaps the toughest test he faced came not from enemy armies, but from an unseen foe, a deadly plague. Yes, I'm talking about those dark days, the days that have gone down in history as the Antonine Plague. It is said that this terrible pestilence was carried into Roman territory with soldiers from the east. At a time when the empire was crowning triumph after triumph, this invisible enemy began to spread silently and relentlessly. People woke up one morning to find that life around them was rapidly dying out. Fever, frightening sores on the skin, and difficulty breathing signaled illness. Doctors were helpless. Even the wisest physicians were unable to understand the source of this disease. The epidemic soon spread to every corner of Rome, deeply affecting not only the population, but also the army and the economy. Marcus Aurelius was compelled to wage a war against this invisible enemy. But it was a war that had to be fought not with sword and shield, but with patience, reason, and order. The epidemic threatened not only lives, but the very fabric of the empire. Fields were empty and labor was dwindling. The treasury was rapidly dwindling, and Marcus was struggling to maintain the strength of his army, while trying to meet the needs of the people. But, my dear friends, Marcus Aurelius was not only a soldier and a leader. He was also a philosopher. In every problem he faced, he clung to his Stoic philosophy. In his meditations, he is said to have written the following words about these difficult days. Life is defined not by the difficulties we face, but by our reactions to them. Even in the midst of this catastrophe, Marcus was trying not to lose his inner peace. The emperor took extensive measures to deal with the crisis. Army hospitals were built, relief organizations were created, and wise doctors from all over Rome were summoned to the capital. In the process, Marcus gained the trust and affection of his people through one-to-one contact with them. Risking his own health and life, he worked to prevent the spread of the disease. But these efforts came at a price. The empire's treasury was running out, taxes were increased, and this led to discontent among the population. When the epidemic ended, Rome had to fight to return to its former glory. But Marcus Aurelius's lesson to his people was a guide to overcoming not only disease, but all disasters. Patience, perseverance, and solidarity. This was an example of how deeply a leader can connect with his people. But my friends, Marcus Aurelius's ordeal was far from over. How do you think the shadow of this catastrophe affected his family, and especially the heir to the throne? Here is where an interesting twist of fate awaits us. My dear friends, in the most interesting corners of that magical mirror we call history, there are not only battles and victories, but also stories that reveal the depths of the human soul. Here we now enter the palace of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor of Rome. But here you will find a world of complexity, love, and sometimes disappointment rather than splendor. Marcus Aurelius's personal life was not like that of an ordinary ruler in every aspect. His wife Faustina, who accompanied him throughout his life, is referred to in different ways in historical sources. Some see her as a loyal wife, a staunch supporter of her husband in the most difficult days of the empire. Others portray her as someone who was involved in palace intrigues and damaged Marcus's reputation. But what we do know is that Faustina left a deep mark on Marcus's life. Their union was not only a political but also an emotional partnership. Over the years, together they raised their children and shouldered the burden of the Roman Empire. Specifically in writing such books as Faustina's Life and Marcus's Journal. And those children, my friends, this is where the story takes a completely different turn. Among Marcus Aurelius's children, one in particular made a huge impact on history: Commodus. Marcus had high expectations of him. He hoped his son would be a virtuous, wise, and just leader. But Commodus, unlike his father, became a leader who reveled in power, loved ostentation, and was sometimes feared by his people. Commodus's passion for gladiatorial fights and his unusual style of governance are evidence of how different a path he chose from his father's. Now you may ask, why did the son of a philosopher-emperor choose such a path? The answer perhaps lies in the complex relationship between father and son. Marcus's disciplined and stoic approach may have clashed with Commodus's free spirit. But Marcus's family was not only about conflict. In his personal writings, it is possible to see the love he felt for his children and the deep responsibility he felt as a father. These writings are a window into how even an emperor felt: family ties and personal pain. Now let's move away from this personal story and look at Marcus Aurelius's approach to the religious and philosophical structure in Rome. Imagine that Rome had a polytheistic belief system at that time. Gods like Jupiter, Mars, and Venus played a big role in the daily life of the people. Temples were overflowing, people were asking for blessings and victory from the gods. However, Marcus Aurelius always approached this religious structure with a philosophical distance. While he respected people's beliefs, he believed in the power of human reason and virtue rather than the power of the gods. Christianity was slowly emerging on the borders of Rome at this time. For the empire, a new belief system was seen as a threat to the traditional order. Although Marcus Aurelius is not remembered for his harsh policy towards Christians, it is difficult to say that he treated them with complete tolerance. His philosophy emphasized that the individual must remain true to his own moral values. He therefore watched the rapidly growing Christian faith carefully but cautiously. Ah, dear friends, such was the world of Marcus Aurelius. The ups and downs within the family on the one hand, and the struggle to balance the religious structure of the empire on the other. So what legacy would Commodus' accession leave for Rome? What would this powerful empire face after the death of Marcus? It is with these questions that we move on to the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, we are now approaching one of the most moving and unforgettable scenes in history. Marcus Aurelius was not only an emperor, but a philosopher, a father, and a sage who guided Rome through its turbulent years. But like all mortals, his mortal body would one day come to an end. And so we come to one of those dark, yet instructive moments for the Roman Empire. The last days of Marcus Aurelius. The year is 180. The Roman Empire is still glorious, but there have long been endless wars to defend the imperial territory. Marcus bore the burden of these wars not only with his soldiers, but also with his heart. A man who had longed for peace all his life had spent the last years of his life on the battlefield. During a long and arduous campaign against the Germanic tribes, the emperor's health began to fail. His weakened body could no longer withstand the weight of the responsibilities he had carried for so long. Even as his illness progressed, Marcus chose to remain at the head of his army, giving them courage and hope for victory. Because he was not just a ruler, he was the source of trust for his soldiers. Marcus Aurelius knew his death was imminent. In the last days of his life, he took refuge in his favorite ideas, the Stoic philosophy. He did not see death as an enemy, but as a part of nature, the ultimate destiny of every living being. As he always emphasized in his writings, we must accept whatever nature offers us. In the dim light of the imperial tent, perhaps he found himself between the pages of the Meditations. Those deep and wise thoughts, written with his own pen, now comforted him. In his last moments, he is said to have called his son Commodus to his side. Historians write that this moment was both dramatic and tragic. Marcus tried to explain to his son how he should carry the burdens of the empire. But my dear friends, Commodus's character was completely opposite to that of his father. Could Marcus have foreseen what his son would bring to Rome in the future? Or did he believe that everything would work out in time? Perhaps only Marcus knew the answer to that question. But the truth was that a father's influence on his son was not always what he had hoped for. Marcus Aurelius died on March 17, 180, in Vindobona, near present-day Vienna. His death was a great loss not only for Rome, but for all humanity. For he was not only a leader, but a sage who believed in the power of virtue and human reason. A deep mourning began among the people. Some claimed he was a god, others simply remembered him as a good man. But either way, Rome had lost one of the most valuable rulers in its history. Marcus's legacy lived on, not only through his success in governance or his courage on the battlefields, but also through his philosophy. His meditations have been a guide for millions of people over the centuries. Those who wanted to understand human nature, the meaning of life, and the inevitability of death turned to his thoughts. After his death, Rome entered a completely different era. Commodus ascended to the throne, And as one era ended in Rome, another began. But my dear friends, could Commodus really protect his father's legacy? And despite Marcus Aurelius's best efforts, how would the future of Rome be shaped? For the answers to these questions, we will continue our story. Now take a deep breath, because the next stage of history will be much more turbulent. My dear friends, let's talk about what happened in Rome after Marcus Aurelius. A philosopher king casts a long shadow, and those who follow Marcus, who left his mark on the throne with his wisdom, may find it difficult to bear the weight of that shadow. And the most obvious example of this difficulty is his son Commodus. Commodus sat on the throne of Rome with the vast legacy left behind by his father, but instead of protecting and developing it, he let it slip away. Let's dive into one of the most turbulent periods in Roman history. With the death of Marcus Aurelius, Rome came under the rule of Commodus. Commodus, however, was far from being an emperor who adopted his father's wise leadership. Unlike his father, he saw rule as a right rather than a responsibility. He was a young man of only 18 when he ascended the imperial throne. He lacked his father's weary experience on the battlefields. His world was surrounded by the pomp of the arenas, the excitement of gladiatorial fights, and the glamour of entertainment. Even in the early years of Commodus's rule, tension was palpable in Rome. The order that Marcus Aurelius had built up over the years was beginning to unravel at the hands of his son. His father's wars against the Germanic tribes were brought to an end, a relief to a populace that wanted peace, but the long-term strategic advantage Marcus had aimed for had been ignored. Commodus had built a world for himself within the gold-leafed walls of Rome, rather than in the dusty realities of the battlefields. But the real issue, my dear friends, was the character of Commodus. His style of governance was shaped in opposition to his father's sense of virtue. His father had worked for the welfare of the people and governed himself with Stoic ideas. Commodus, on the other hand, preferred to descend into the gladiatorial arenas to show his power and present himself as one of the gods of Rome. Yes, you heard that right. This young emperor of Roman history wanted to be not only a leader but also a gladiator. Instead of being a sage for his people, he chose to become a figure who entertained them. He had fought his way into the Republic. These tendencies of his also damaged the political order of Rome. The Senate was virtually helpless in the face of Commodus's arbitrary decisions and corrupt rule. The balanced system that Marcus Aurelius ruled in cooperation with the Senate turned into a power struggle in his son's time. Commodus, unlike his father, saw himself as an absolute ruler and perceived the senators as rivals. He even had many of them executed, darkening the political climate in Rome. But the most memorable aspect of Commodus was his self-proclamation of himself as a god. He thought he was gaining great popularity among the people by participating in gladiatorial fights. Of course, this was interesting for some of the common people, but for the noble families of Rome and members of the Senate, it was a scandal. Commodus began to think of himself as the reincarnation of Hercules and had huge statues of him erected all over Rome. Having inherited the empire from his father, this young man was now a prisoner not only of Rome, but also of his own ego. My dear friends, Commodus' rule was a turning point not only for the people of Rome, but also for the imperial system. His actions set Rome's future on a dark path. The edifice that Marcus Aurelius had wisely built began to crumble at the hands of Commodus. Eventually, even his own guards could not stand his despotic rule and assassinated him. Commodus became a victim not of the Rome his father had envisioned, but of the chaos of his own making. But the story of Rome does not end here, my friends. The period following Commodus would open the door to an even greater transformation for the empire. But how did Rome emerge from these turbulent times? How did Marcus Aurelius's legacy survive beyond the wreckage left by Commodus? The recent death of Roman Prince Marcellus shifted the legacy, shifted the world in the first decade of the Renaissance.